Sometimes the heart forgets what it means to be alive until one moment brings it all rushing back. For 23 years, Thorne Calloway lived alone in the Montana mountains, surrounded by nothing but silence and snow. Then a half-frozen woman named Mara stumbled to his cabin door. She was running from a world that had taken everything from her. He gave her shelter, food, and warmth by his fire. When she laughed over a simple bowl of stew, everything changed. That sound broke something open inside him that had been locked away since he was 12 years old. What started as one winter night became a lifetime. Mara didn't just thaw his frozen heart. She gave him 11 sons and built a legacy that would echo through those mountains for generations. How does a man who forgot how to live learn to love again? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The dawn came grey and cold over the peaks of the Bitterroot Range, same as it had for 8,000 mornings before. Thorne Calloway stood at his cabin window, watching frost crystals catch the first light on glass he'd cut and fitted himself. The silence wrapped around him like an old coat familiar, worn thin in places, but still keeping out the worst of the world's chill. At 35, Thorne carried himself with the quiet economy of movement that came from living where every action mattered. His dark hair hung past his shoulders, streaked silver at the temples despite his years. Ice crystals clung to his beard from checking the snares before sunrise, and his hands scarred from axe work and rough from wind moved, with practiced certainty as he built up the fire. The cabin reflected 23 years of careful solitude. Every beam he'd hewn by hand, every joint fitted true. The walls held the accumulated warmth of countless fires, and shelves lined with books, carved bowls, and tools spoke to a mind that had found ways to stay sharp in isolation. In the corner sat his greatest achievement and deepest comforter chess, set carved from mountain maple. The pieces worn smooth from handling during long winter evenings when he played both sides of games that lasted for weeks. He'd started the chess set in his 3rd year alone, when the silence had grown so heavy he feared it might crush him. Each piece took months to complete, carved by lamplight while snow piled against the windows. The king bore his father's stern features, the queen his mother's gentle smile. The bishops carried the faces of the preachers who'd tried to save his soul after the fire, and the knights looked like the horses he'd ridden as a boy. Every piece held a memory, and every game was a conversation with ghosts. The morning routine never varied: check the weather, tend the fire, inventory supplies, plan the day's work. Winter demanded respect in these mountain-sown mistake, one moment of carelessness, and the cold would claim you as surely as it had claimed the deer whose tracks he'd followed yesterday. He pulled on his coat, a masterwork of tanned hides and careful stitching that had kept him alive through 24 brutal winters. Outside, the world stretched white and endless. His nearest neighbor lived 60 miles down the mountain, and the last time Thorne had seen another human being was 8 months ago, when a lost prospector had stumbled into his camp. The man had been half dead from exposure, and Thorne had nursed him back to health, shared his food and fire, and listened to news from the world below. Towns growing, railroads spreading, people rushing toward some future that seemed to have little use for men like him. When the prospector left, he'd asked Thorne why he stayed in such isolation. "Man gets used to his own company," Thorne had answered, which was true enough. But the deeper truth was harder to speak, that at 12 years old, he'd learned how quickly everything you love can turn to ash and smoke, and up here in the thin air and endless quiet, nothing could burn but wood. The fire that had taken his family lived in his dreams still. His parents' farm, his little sister Sarah, the hired hands who'd become like Uncle Saul, gone in one October night when a spark from the kitchen chimney found the dry barn roof. He'd been the only survivor, pulled from the burning house by neighbors who arrived too late for anyone else. The families in town had been kind, but every pitying look, every gentle word, had felt like salt in an open wound. So he'd run, At 12, with nothing but his father's rifle and the clothes on his back, he'd headed for the mountains where the silence couldn't judge him and the cold couldn't disappoint him. The first years had nearly killed him, but slowly he'd learned the mountains' lessons: when to hunt, when to wait, how to read weather in the color of clouds, how to find shelter in a storm. He'd built this cabin in his 17th year, choosing a spot where two valleys met and the view stretched for miles in every direction. A creek ran year-round nearby, providing water and drawing game. The forest offered timber, game, and the 100 small gifts that kept a man alive if he knew how to look. In summer, he tended a small garden and gathered what the mountain provided. In winter, he lived on stored meat and vegetables, spending long evenings by the fire with his books and his carved chess pieces. The isolation had shaped him into something different from other men. Bitter, exactly, but weathered in ways that went deeper than skin. He'd learned to find contentment in small things: the perfect fit of a dovetail joint, the way morning light caught steam rising from his coffee cup, the satisfaction of a clean shot that brought down a deer quickly and mercifully. He'd made peace with loneliness, the way other men made peace with wives', a daily choice that defined the shape of their days. But peace and contentment weren't the same as happiness, and Thorn knew the difference even if he rarely let himself think about it. Sometimes, in the deepest part of winter, when the snow piled past the windows and the world outside disappeared entirely, he'd find himself listening for sounds that never came: voices calling his name, laughter echoing off the mountain walls, the rustle of skirts and gentle footsteps on his cabin floor. Those were dangerous thoughts, and he'd learned to push them away with work. There was always something needing repair or improvement, always another book to read, another chess problem to solve. He'd taught himself carpentry and blacksmithing, herbal medicine and weather prediction. He could set bones and dress wounds, tan hides and preserve meat, predict storms days before they arrived. The mountain had made him into a complete man in every way but one. The wind picked up as morning wore toward noon, carrying the scent of snow that was still hours away, but coming sure as sunset. Thorn checked his snares, finding 2 rabbits that had fed his trapline overnight. He cleaned them with quick, efficient movements, saving every scrap of meat and fur. Waste was a luxury he couldn't afford, and besides, something deep in his nature rebelled against taking more than he needed. Walking back toward the cabin, he noticed how the light fell differently on the snow, how the peaks seemed to lean closer together, as if the mountains themselves sensed the approaching storm. Weather was coming, not just snow, but the kind of storm that could change everything in its path. He'd learned to trust these instincts over the years, the way the air felt different before major changes, the way animals behaved when something significant approached. Inside, he added wood to the fire and set coffee to boil in the pot that had served him faithfully for 15 years. The cabin held its warmth well, testament to careful construction and constant maintenance. Every log was chink-tight, every board fitted true. He'd built it to last, though for what or whom, he'd never let himself wonder too deeply. As afternoon shadows began to stretch across the valley floor, Thorn settled into his chair by the window with the chess set before him. He was working through a particularly complex middle game, one that had occupied his evenings for a week. The White King faced a difficult choice: safety in retreat or bold advance into uncertain territory. Both paths carried risk, both offered possibilities. He moved the White King forward 1 square, committing to the bolder path, and immediately saw 3 new problems the move created. But it also opened opportunities that hadn't existed before. Sometimes, he'd learned, the most dangerous choice was also the only one that led anywhere worth going. Outside, the first snowflakes began to fall, each one distinct and perfect in the fading light. The storm was beginning, and with it, the kind of change that a man couldn't plan for or predict. Thorn watched the snow gathering strength and felt something shift in the careful order of his world, though he couldn't have said what or why. In the distance, barely audible above the wind, came a sound that might have been human or might have been the mountain itself calling. He listened more carefully, but it didn't come again. Probably just the storm playing tricks, the way weather could make you hear things that weren't there. He turned back to his chess game, but found his concentration broken. The white king seemed suddenly exposed on its forward square, committed to a path with no clear outcome. Thorn studied the board for a long moment, then carefully moved the piece back to safety. Outside, the storm gathered strength, and somewhere in its howling voice, something was calling through the darkness toward his door. The pounding on his door came near midnight, violent and desperate against the howling storm. Thorn woke instantly. 23 years of mountain living, having honed his senses to detect anything unnatural in the darkness. The sound came again, not the random battering of wind-blown debris, but the deliberate hammering of human fists against wood. He rolled from his bed, feet finding the cold floor as his hand closed around the rifle that never strayed far from reach. The storm had been building for hours, and anyone caught in it would be fighting for their life. Through the window, he could see nothing but swirling white, snow driving horizontal in sheets that would blind a person at 10 paces. The pounding grew weaker, more erratic. Whoever stood outside was losing strength fast. Thorn moved to the door, rifle ready, but not raised. In weather like this, desperation could make people dangerous, but it could also make them dead if help didn't come quickly. "Who's there?" he called through the heavy timber. A voice answered, barely audible above the wind-high, strained, unmistakably female. "Please help me. I can't feel my hands." Thorn's training in mountain survival warred with 23 years of chosen isolation. But the voice carried something beyond desperation, a quality of refined speech that spoke of education, of a life lived far from these peaks, and underneath it all, the unmistakable sound of someone very close to dying. He threw back the heavy bar and opened the door. The woman who fell across his threshold was more ice than flesh. Snow caked her dark hair and eyebrows, and her lips showed the blue-white of severe frostbite. She wore a traveling dress, wholly inadequate for mountain weather, now stiff with frozen moisture and torn from fighting through snow-laden branches. Her hands, when he caught her falling form, felt like carved stone. "Dear God," he whispered, the first words he'd spoken aloud in months. She tried to speak, but managed only a rattling breath that puffed white in the frigid air. Her eyes, startling green even in the lamplight, found his face with the desperate focus of someone clinging to consciousness through sheer will. Thorn didn't hesitate. He lifted her easily, surprised by how light she felt, and kicked the door shut against the storm. The sudden silence felt profound after the wind's constant roar. He carried her to the chair nearest the fire, his mind already working through the steps needed to save someone this close to freezing to death. First, get her warm, but not too quickly. Rapid warming could stop a heart that was barely beating. He added wood to the fire but banked it to prevent flare-ups. Then he began removing her frozen clothing, clinical in his efficiency but gentle in his movements. Her dress came away in pieces, the fabric having frozen and cracked. Underneath, her chemise and corset were only slightly less damaged. As he worked, he found himself noticing details his isolation-trained mind catalogued automatically. Her hands bore the calluses of someone who worked with herbs and medicinal burns from hot implements, stains that spoke of plant dyes and chemical compounds. A healer, then, or someone with medical knowledge. Her wedding ring, a simple gold band, remained frozen to her finger. He wrapped her in furs and wool blankets, then set water to warming on the fire. Not hot, lukewarm, to gradually bring her body temperature up without shocking her system. He'd seen men die from careless warming after severe exposure, their hearts stopping from the sudden change. While the water heated, he examined her more carefully. Frostbite marked her fingertips and toes, but it looked superficial, painful, and slow to heal, but not the deep damage that cost digits. Her breathing was shallow but steady, and when he checked her pulse at wrist and throat, he found it weak but regular. "You're going to live," he told her quietly, unsure if she could hear him. But it was close. Another hour out there and... He stopped himself. No point dwelling on what might have been. He began the slow process of warming her extremities, dipping cloth in the lukewarm water and pressing it gently to her hands and feet. She stirred at the touch, a soft moan escaping her lips. Her eyelids fluttered, but didn't open. "Easy," he murmured. "You're safe now." As he worked, Thorn found himself studying her face in the firelight. She was beautiful, but it was a mature beauty laugh, lines at the corners of her eyes, character etched in the set of her mouth. This was a woman who had lived, who had known joy and sorrow in equal measure. Probably in her early 30s, he guessed, though the ordeal had drawn her features tight with exhaustion. The wedding ring caught the light as he warmed her hands. Recently widowed, perhaps fleeing from grief or circumstances he couldn't guess. Women didn't travel alone in these mountains unless something had driven them to desperation. She stirred again, this time managing to open her eyes. They fixed on his face with surprising clarity, and he saw intelligence there, sharp, assessing, even through her exhaustion. "Where?" she started, then stopped to wet her lips. "Where am I?" "My cabin," Thorn said simply. "About 40 miles up from the valley floor. You were nearly frozen when you reached my door." She tried to sit up, and he helped her, keeping the blankets tucked around her shoulders. "I was there, was a storm. My horse threw me when lightning struck near. I walked, but I got turned around in the snow." "Your horse?" "Gone. Probably dead by now, poor thing." Sadness flickered across her features. "I had supplies, medicine for—" She stopped, seeming to remember where she was and who she was talking to. "I'm sorry, I don't mean to impose. If you could just—" "You're not going anywhere tonight," Thorn said firmly. "Storm like this could last 3 days, maybe more." She looked around the cabin, taking in the orderly shelves, the carefully maintained tools, the books lined along the walls. Her gaze lingered on the chess set near the window. "You live here alone," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "For how long?" Thorn hesitated. 23 years. Something shifted in her expression, surprise, perhaps, or a kind of recognition. "That's a long time to be alone." "It suits me." She studied his face for a moment, and he had the uncomfortable feeling that she was seeing more than he intended to show. "I'm Mara," she said finally. "Mara Ellison. Thorn Calloway." "Thank you, Thorn Calloway, for saving my life." He nodded, unsure how to respond to gratitude. It had been so long since anyone had cause to thank him for anything. "You should eat something, build your strength back up." He ladled stew from the pot that hung constantly over his fire, adding extra meat and vegetables. The smell filled the cabin, rich, warming, touched with the herbs he gathered each summer. When he handed her the bowl, their fingers brushed briefly, and he felt the shock of human contact after so many years of solitude. Mara ate slowly, savoring each bite with the appreciation of someone who had faced real hunger. "This is wonderful," she said. "What's the seasoning? I can taste wild sage, but there's something else." "Mountain thyme, and a little honey from the bees that nest in the cliff face. You know herbs. You have to, up here. No doctors for 100 miles. "I'm a healer," she said quietly. "Was, anyway. Before." She stopped, her spoon halfway to her mouth, and for a moment her face crumpled with some private grief. Before Thorn could ask what had happened, she did something completely unexpected. She laughed not with humor, but with a kind of rueful acceptance of fate's cruel turns. It was a sound full of life and resilience, musical in a way that seemed to fill every corner of the silent cabin. The spoon fell from Thorn's hand, clattering against the wooden floor. 23 years. 23 years since he'd heard a woman laugh, since he'd heard that particular pitch of sound that spoke of femininity and warmth and all the things he'd convinced himself he didn't need. The sound hit him like a physical blow, awakening something in his chest that he'd thought long dead. Mara looked up, concerned by his reaction. "Are you all right?" Thorn stared at her, this woman who had appeared out of a storm like something from a dream. Her hair was drying now, falling in dark waves past her shoulders. Her cheeks had regained their color, and her eyes held depths he found himself wanting to explore. "It's been," he started, then stopped. How could he explain what that simple sound had done to him? How it had cracked something open inside him that he'd kept carefully sealed for more than 2 decades. "It's been a long time since I heard a woman laugh," he said finally. Understanding dawned in her eyes, followed by something that might have been compassion. 23 years? He nodded, not trusting his voice. Mara set down her bowl and pulled the blankets tighter around herself. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the cabin, something fundamental had shifted. The careful order of Thorne's solitary world had been disrupted by more than just an unexpected visitor. It had been changed by the sound of joy, by the reminder that there were still things in the world worth laughing about. "Well," she said softly, "then I suppose we both have some healing to do." The storm lasted 3 days, and in those 3 days, Thorne's world changed in ways he couldn't have imagined. Mara proved to be unlike anyone he'd encountered during his rare contacts with the outside world. She possessed a quiet strength that spoke of someone who had faced hardship and emerged stronger, and an intelligence that matched his own years of solitary study. On the morning after her arrival, she woke before him something that hadn't happened to Thorne in 20 years. He found her standing at the window, wrapped in one of his heavy wool blankets, watching the snow fall in thick, silent curtains. "It's beautiful," she said without turning around, "terrible and beautiful at the same time." Thorne studied her profile in the grey morning light. "That's the mountain's way. Everything here serves 2 purposes." She turned to face him, and he saw that she'd been crying not from sadness, but from something deeper. Relief, perhaps, or the release of tensions she'd carried for longer than the storm had lasted. "I thought I was going to die out there," she said simply. "I made my peace with it, actually. There are worse ways to go than falling asleep in the snow." The matter-of-fact way she spoke of her near death chilled him more than the mountain wind ever had. "What drove you up here, Mara, in a storm like that, with no proper gear?" She was quiet for a long moment, her fingers worrying at something in the folds of the blanket. When she brought her hand into view, he saw she held a small leather pouch, worn soft with handling. "My healing supplies," she said, opening it to reveal an assortment of dried herbs, small vials, and delicate instruments. "What's left of them, anyway? I had more, but—" She stopped, seeming to gather herself. "My husband died 6 months ago. Pneumonia. I couldn't save him." Thorne watched her carefully arrange the contents of the pouch on his table, her movements precise, despite the sadness in her voice. The tools spoke of serious medical knowledge: surgical needles of different sizes, tiny measuring spoons, vials with handwritten labels in what he recognized as Latin. "After he died, people stopped coming to me for healing," she continued. "If I couldn't save my own husband, how could I save anyone else? The bank took our land. The town decided it was time for me to move along. So you came up here. I heard there were mining camps in the high country, places where a healer might be needed, where people wouldn't ask too many questions about a woman traveling alone." She touched one of the vials, her expression growing distant. "I got lost in the storm. My horse spooked and threw me. I thought maybe it was meant to be, a sign that I should stop fighting so hard, to stay in a world that didn't want me anymore." Thorne felt something twist in his chest at her words. He recognized the tone, the careful acceptance of isolation as a natural state. It was the same voice he'd used when he'd convinced himself that solitude was a choice rather than a wound. "The world's a fool, then," he said gruffly. Mara looked up at him, surprise flickering across her features. "You don't know me. I know you traveled 100 miles through dangerous country to help people who might need healing. I know you nearly died rather than give up that pouch of medicines. I know you've got hands that are gentle enough to handle delicate instruments, but strong enough to do real work." He gestured toward her supplies. "The world doesn't get to decide what you're worth." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Mara began carefully repacking her herbs, but Thorne caught the small smile that touched the corners of her mouth. "Thank you," she said quietly. Over the following days, They settled into an easy routine that surprised them both with its naturalness. Thorn had expected the presence of another person to feel intrusive, to disturb the careful rhythms he'd established over decades of solitude. Instead, Mara seemed to understand instinctively how to move through his space without disrupting it. She proved to be endlessly curious about his life on the mountain, asking thoughtful questions about everything from his hunting techniques to the books that lined his shelves. When she discovered his collection of medical text volumes he'd acquired through rare trips to trading posts over the Yersha, excitement was genuine and infectious. "Gray's Anatomy," she breathed, running her fingers along the spine of one thick volume. "I've only seen drawings from this. Where did you find it?" "Trading post down in Missoula, about 8 years ago. Man was selling off a doctor's library." Thorn pulled the book from the shelf and handed it to her. Figured medical knowledge might come in handy up here. Mara opened the book with the reverence she might have shown a religious text, studying the detailed anatomical drawings with professional interest. "You've studied this?" "Some. Enough to set bones and treat wounds. Mountain doesn't give you much choice about learning to patch yourself up." She looked up at him with new appreciation. "You're not what I expected when I first saw you." "What did you expect?" "A hermit. Someone who'd rejected learning along with human company." She gestured toward his books, his carefully organized tools, the chest set by the window. "This is the home of an educated man." Thorn felt heat rise in his cheeks. "My father believed in education, made sure I could read and figure before I came up here." "What did he do?" "Your father?" "Farmer. But he'd been a teacher before he married my mother. Said a man without learning was just an animal with opposable thumbs." The words came easier than he'd expected. He hadn't spoken of his family in years, but something about Mara's quiet attention made the memories feel less dangerous. "He sounds like a wise man." He was. They both were. Mara must have heard something in his voice, because she didn't press for more. Instead, she turned back to the anatomy book, studying a diagram of the human heart with intense concentration. "This shows the ventricles more clearly than any drawing I've seen," she said. "Would you mind if would it be all right if I studied this while I'm here?" The phrase "while I'm here" hung between them, a reminder that this arrangement was temporary, that the storm would end and she would leave. Thorn found the thought more disturbing than he cared to examine. "Of course," he said. "Take whatever time you need." That afternoon, while Mara studied his medical texts, Thorn found himself watching her with growing fascination. She read with complete absorption, occasionally making soft sounds of discovery or understanding. Her presence filled the cabin in ways that had nothing to do with physical space, the rustle of pages turning, the scratch of her taking notes on scraps of paper, the way she unconsciously hummed under her breath when something particularly interested her. When she examined his own collection of mountain herbs, her excitement was impossible to contain. "You have devil's club root," she said, holding up a carefully dried specimen. "And this is this bare root?" "Osha," Thorn confirmed. "Found it growing near the high meadows. Takes years to mature enough for harvesting. It's perfect. The preparation, the drying, you know exactly what you're doing." She looked up at him with something approaching awe. "You're not just a survivalist, Thorn. You're a healer, too. I just know what works." "That's what healing is," she said firmly, "knowing what works and having the patience to do it right." That evening, she insisted on examining the old wound in his shoulder that still ached in bad weather, a legacy from a hunting accident 5 years earlier where he'd taken a hard fall on rocky ground. "You set this yourself?" she asked, her fingers probing gently around the old break. "Didn't have much choice. It healed well, but there's still some inflammation. The bone fragments didn't quite align properly." She reached for her herb pouch. "I can make a compress that will help with the pain. Take down the swelling." Her touch was professional but gentle, her hands sure as she mixed herbs and prepared a poultice. Thorn found himself acutely aware of her nearness, the concentration on her face as she worked, the way her breath moved in soft puffs in the cool cabin air. "There," she said, securing the compress with strips of clean cloth. Leave that on overnight. The arnica will reduce inflammation, and the willow bark will help with pain. Thank you. She began cleaning her implements, every movement economical and precise. It feels good to practice again, to help someone. You're good at it. I was better before. Her voice carried a note of sadness. Before I started doubting everything I knew. Doubt's not always a bad thing, Thorne said carefully. Sometimes it means you care enough to question yourself. Mara looked at him with surprise, as if she hadn't expected such insight from a mountain hermit. Is that what you tell yourself, when the doubt gets too heavy? The question hit closer to home than he'd expected. I tell myself that some things are worth the questioning, others you just have to accept and move forward. And how do you tell the difference? Thorne considered this as he watched her pack away her herbs. Time, I suppose. And whether the questioning helps you heal or just keeps the wound fresh. That night, as the storm continued to rage outside, they sat by the fire reading his medical texts, he working on a new chess piece he'd started carving. The silence between them felt comfortable, natural, like something they'd shared for years rather than days. When Mara laughed at something, she read in one of his books a surprised, delighted sound at some medical illustration or description. Thorne's hands stilled on his carving. The sound still affected him as powerfully as that first night, but now it carried something more than just the shock of human connection. It carried the possibility of something he'd never dared to imagine, that maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to spend the rest of his life alone. On the fourth morning, the storm finally broke. Thorne woke to brilliant sunlight streaming through the cabin windows, and the profound silence that followed mountain blizzards. No wind, no rattling of shutters, just the deep quiet of fresh snow settling into place. Mara stood at the window again, but this time her posture spoke of difficult decisions rather than simple admiration of the landscape. The world outside lay transformed, sculpted into fantastic shapes by 3 days of driving wind and snow. Drifts reached nearly to the cabin's eaves in places, while other areas had been scoured clean down to bare rock. The pass will be blocked for weeks, Thorne said quietly, joining her at the window. Maybe until spring thaw. I know. She didn't turn to look at him. I should probably try to get word to someone. Let them know I'm alive. Who would you send word to? The question hung between them for a long moment. Finally, Mara shook her head slightly. No one, I suppose. There's no one left who'd be waiting to hear. Thorne felt something twist in his chest at the loneliness in her voice. He recognized it too well, the careful way she spoke of having no ties, no one to worry about her absence. It was the same practiced indifference he'd cultivated over his years of isolation. You're welcome to stay, he said, the words coming out more gruffly than he'd intended. Until the pass clears, I mean. It would be good to have someone with medical knowledge nearby in case of accident. It was a thin excuse, and they both knew it. But it allowed them both to pretend this was practical rather than personal, a matter of mutual benefit rather than the increasingly clear fact that neither of them wanted to return to their former solitude. I could help with supplies, Mara said carefully, hunting, preserving food. I know herbs that grow at high altitude, and I could if you got injured or sick. Yes, Thorne said, perhaps too quickly. That would be helpful. They looked at each other then, both understanding that they'd just negotiated something much more significant than a temporary arrangement. The air between them felt charged with possibility and risk in equal measure. That afternoon, Thorne began teaching Mara the realities of mountain survival. He started with the basics, reading weather signs, understanding how snow behaved at different temperatures, recognizing the difference between safe ice and the thin shells that could kill the unwary. The mountain doesn't forgive mistakes, he told her as they stood outside the cabin, both bundled in heavy furs against the bitter cold. But it's not malicious either. It just is what it is. Respect that, and you can live here. Fight it, and it will kill you. Mara proved to be an apt student, asking intelligent questions and grasping concepts quickly. She had the kind of mind that understood systems and patterns, making connections between seemingly unrelated phenomena. When he showed her how to read wind patterns in the way snow had drifted around trees and rocks, she immediately began applying the same principles to predict how future storms might behave. The lee side of that ridge would be a death trap in a blizzard, she said, pointing to a formation across the valley. The wind would create a downdraft that could bury someone in minutes. Exactly. Thorn found himself impressed by how quickly she'd grasped concepts that had taken him years to fully understand. You think like the mountain? I think like a healer, she corrected. You learn to see how systems work together, how one problem can cascade into others if you don't address the root cause. That evening, as they sat by the fire, Thorn found himself sharing stories he'd never told another, soul tales of his early years on the mountain, the mistakes that had nearly killed him, the slow process of learning to live with the wilderness rather than against it. The first winter, I nearly starved, he admitted, whittling shavings from a piece of pine as he spoke. I thought I knew enough about hunting and preserving food, but I didn't understand the mountain's rhythms. Didn't know when the game would move to lower elevations or how long the deep cold would last. How did you survive? Stubbornness mostly, and luck. He paused in his whittling, remembering those desperate months. Found a deer that had died in an avalanche, frozen solid but still good meat. That carried me through to spring. You were just a boy. 17. Old enough to know better, young enough to think I was immortal. He resumed his carving, the rhythm of the blade against wood soothing. The mountain taught me otherwise. Mara watched his hands as he worked, fascinated by the sure, economical movements. What are you making? Thorn held up the piece he'd been working on, a chess piece in the early stages of formation. A rook. My set's missing one. Lost it in a creek crossing 3 years ago. May I see the others? He brought the chess set to the firelight, setting it carefully on the table between them. Mara examined each piece with the same attention she'd given his medical books, her fingers tracing the intricate details he'd carved into the wood. These are extraordinary, she breathed. Look at the expression on this knight, and the queen, she's beautiful. They're not perfect, Thorn said, uncomfortable with the praise. Carving's just something to do during the long winters. No, this is art. She picked up the king, studying the stern but kind face he'd given it. This looks like someone you knew. My father. The admission slipped out before he could stop it. And the queen? My mother. Thorn found himself remembering his parents, not as they'd died screaming, burning, but as they'd lived. His father's patient instruction, his mother's gentle laughter. She used to sing while she worked in the garden, had the prettiest voice you ever heard. Mara set the queen down carefully, her expression thoughtful. You've carved your family into these pieces, made them part of your daily life. The observation struck him as both true and more intimate than he'd intended to reveal. I suppose I have. It's a beautiful way to remember them. That night, Thorn lay awake long after Mara had settled into sleep in the bed he'd given her, while he took the floor by the fire. Her presence had changed more than just the sleeping arrangement, had altered the very air of the cabin, filling it with new sounds and scents and possibilities. He found himself listening to her breathing, steady and quiet in the darkness. It was a sound he'd forgotten the way another person's presence could make a space feel alive in ways that went beyond simple occupation. The cabin had been a shelter for 23 years, but with Mara in it, it was beginning to feel like something more. The next morning brought a surprise that would change everything. Thorn woke to find Mara already up, standing at the window with an expression of alarm on her face. There are men coming up the valley, she said quietly. 3 of them, on horseback. Thorn joined her at the window, his trained eyes picking out the distant figures, working their way through the snow-clogged terrain. Even at this distance, something about their purposeful movement toward his cabin made him uneasy. Riders don't come up here by accident, he said grimly, especially not after a storm like that. Mara's face had gone pale. They're looking for me? How can you be sure? because no one else has any reason to be up here." She turned from the window, already moving toward her few possessions. "I have to go. I won't bring trouble to your door." Thorn caught her arm gently but firmly. "You're not going anywhere. Not in this snow. Not with men hunting you." He reached for his father's rifle, the weapon that had saved his life more times than he could count. "Besides, this is my mountain. I decide who's welcome here." Mara looked at him with a mixture of gratitude and concern. "You don't understand. These meant they won't just go away if you ask them to. Then they'll learn why smart people avoid bothering mountain folk." Thorn said grimly, checking the rifle's action with practiced efficiency. "Whatever drove you up here, whatever they want, we'll face it together." The riders were still an hour away, but already Thorn could feel the careful piece of his world beginning to fracture. For 23 years, he'd avoided the complications that came with human entanglements. Now, with 3 words, "we'll face it," he'd committed himself to a future he couldn't predict or control. But as he looked at Mara, saw the gratitude and dawning hope in her eyes, he knew he'd made the only choice he could live with. The mountain had taught him many things over the years, but perhaps the most important lesson was this: some things were worth fighting for, even when the outcome was uncertain. Outside, the riders continued their steady approach through the snow, and Thorn began preparing for the kind of confrontation he'd spent 23 years avoiding. But he was no longer the 17-year-old boy who'd fled to the mountains to escape the world's cruelty. He was a man with someone to protect. The riders turned back without reaching the cabin. From his concealed position in the rocks above, Thorn watched them through the scope of his rifle as they struggled through the deep snow for another hour before finally acknowledging defeat. The storm had left drifts too deep for their horses to navigate, and the temperature was dropping toward the killing cold that came with mountain nightfall. "Smart enough to know when they're beat," he murmured, lowering the rifle as the 3 figures retreated down the valley. For now. When he returned to the cabin, he found Mara pacing by the window, her face drawn with worry and something that looked like guilt. "They'll be back," she said without preamble. "When the snow settles, when the trails are passable, they'll come back. Then we'll deal with them when they do." Thorn set his rifle in its rack by the door, but kept it within easy reach. "In the meantime, you're safe." "But you're not." She turned to face him, her green eyes bright with unshed tears. "I've brought danger to your door, disrupted the peace you've built here. I should leave before." "No." The word came out sharper than he'd intended. "You're not leaving, Mara. Not for them, not for anyone." Something in his tone made her go still. They looked at each other across the cabin's warm interior, and Thorn felt the weight of words, unspoken, hanging between them. In the days since her arrival, something had shifted in his chest, a gradual thawing of places he'd thought permanently frozen. "Why?" she asked quietly. "Why does it matter to you what happens to me?" The question hung in the air like smoke from the fire, demanding an honesty Thorn wasn't sure he was ready to give. But looking at her face, seeing the genuine confusion there, he found himself speaking the truth he'd barely admitted to himself. "Because for 23 years, I convinced myself that I didn't need anything or anyone, that I was complete on my own." He moved closer, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Then you laughed over a bowl of stew, and I remembered what I'd been missing." Mara's breath caught, and for a moment neither of them moved. Then, slowly, she reached out and touched his face, her fingers tracing the line of his beard with infinite gentleness. "Thorn," she whispered, and his name on her lips sounded like a prayer. He covered her hand with his own, feeling the calluses on her fingers, the strength in her grip. "Stay with me, Mara. Not just until the past clears, not just until those men give up. Stay." "I don't know if I can," she said, but her hand remained against his cheek. "I don't know if I remember how to be happy." "Then we'll learn together." That night, they sat closer by the fire than they had before, their conversation flowing like water finding its natural course. Mara told him about her Mariaga, good union built on mutual respect and shared purpose, but lacking the deeper connection she'd only now begun to understand was possible. "James was a kind man," she said, gazing into the flames. We worked well together, shared similar goals, but there was always something, some part of myself I kept held back, even from him. Why? Fear, I think. Fear that if I gave everything, and then lost it. She paused, struggling with words. When he died, it hurt, but not in the way I thought it should. I grieved for what we'd had, but I also felt guilty that I wasn't more devastated. Does that make me terrible? It makes you honest, Thorne said quietly. There's a difference between loving someone and being in love with them. She looked at him with surprise. How do you know the difference? You said you'd been alone since. Since I was 12, yes, but I remember watching my parents, the way they looked at each other, even after 15 years of marriage. Like they shared some secret the rest of the world couldn't understand. He stirred the fire with a poker, sending sparks spiraling up the chimney. That's what I thought love was supposed to be, that recognition, that sense of finding the other half of yourself. And you never found that with anyone? Never had the chance to look, he admitted. By the time I was old enough to think about such things, I was already committed to this life. Mara was quiet for a long moment, her eyes reflecting the dancing flames. What if I told you that sitting here with you, talking like this, what if I told you it feels more like home than anywhere I've ever been? Thorne's breath caught. I'd say that I know exactly what you mean. Spring came early that year, or perhaps it only seemed that way, because Thorne found himself anticipating each day with an eagerness he'd forgotten was possible. As the snow began to melt and the first green shoots appeared in protected valleys, he and Mara fell into routines that felt as natural as breathing. She proved invaluable in ways he hadn't expected. Her knowledge of medicinal plants complemented his understanding of the mountain's seasonal cycles, and together they expanded his herb garden until it rivaled anything she'd cultivated in her former life. She taught him new preservation techniques for his medical supplies, while he showed her how to read the subtle signs that predicted weather changes days in advance. More importantly, she began to transform the cabin itself, not with dramatic changes, but with small touches that made the space feel warmer, more welcoming. A quilt she began sewing from scraps of his old clothes and fabric from her torn traveling dress, its pattern emerging slowly over long winter evenings. Wildflowers gathered from meadow walks and arranged in carved wooden bowls, the scent of herbs drying in careful bundles from the rafters. The quilt became her favorite project during the quiet hours before sleep. Thorne would work on his chess pieces or read while she stitched by firelight, her needle moving in small, precise motions. Each square told a story, pieces of his old hunting shirt combined with fabric from her blue traveling dress, scraps of wool from his winter coat paired with cotton from her undergarments. It's our history, she explained one evening when he asked about her choice of materials. All the things that brought us together, made into something new. The metaphor wasn't lost on him. Like the quilt, their relationship was being built from the pieces of their separate lives, creating something neither could have imagined alone. As the weather warmed, they ventured further from the cabin together. Mara proved to be a natural in the wilderness, her healer's instincts serving her well in reading the mountain's moods and needs. She learned to move quietly through the forest, to spot game sign, to understand the interconnected relationships between plants and animals that made the mountain ecosystem function. Everything depends on everything else, she observed one afternoon as they gathered wild onions near a creek. Remove one element, and the whole system can collapse. Including us, Thorne said, watching her work with growing admiration. We're part of it now too. Are we? She looked up at him, shading her eyes against the spring sunlight. Sometimes I feel like I'm still just visiting, like I don't really belong here. You belong here, he said firmly. You belong with me. The words hung between them, more declaration than simple reassurance. Mara set down her gathering basket and moved closer to him, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her green eyes. Thorne, she said softly, and then she was in his arms, her lips meeting his with a hunger that spoke of months of careful restraint, finally breaking free. The kiss was everything he'd imagined and nothing he'd expected, soft and fierce, tentative and certain all at once. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard. Mara rested her forehead against his chest. "I love you," she whispered. "I didn't plan to, didn't think I could, but I do." "I love you too," he replied, the words feeling both foreign and completely natural on his tongue. "I think I have since that first night when you laughed." That evening, they made love for the first time in front of the fire, with the marriage quilt spread beneath them like a blessing. It was gentle and passionate by turns, a conversation conducted in touch and breath and whispered endearments. Afterward, as they lay entwined in the firelight, Thorn felt a completeness he'd never known was possible. "Marry me," he said suddenly, the words surprising him as much as her. Mara lifted her head to look at him, her hair falling like a curtain around their faces. "There's no preacher here, no church." "There's us," he said simply. "There's this mountain, this sky. What more do we need?" She smiled, the expression lighting up her entire face. "Nothing," she said. "We need nothing more than this." They married themselves the next evening, under a canopy of stars, with the mountain peaks as witnesses. Thorn spoke vows he'd never planned, words that came from some deep well of feeling he'd thought permanently sealed. Mara's promises were equally heartfelt, her voice strong and clear in the mountain silence. When they exchanged rinches carved from mountain maple, hers from a piece of silver he'd traded for years ago, ceremony felt as binding as anything conducted in a cathedral. More so, perhaps, because it was freely chosen, untainted by external pressure or expectation. 3 months later, Mara told him she was carrying their first child. "Are you certain?" he asked, his hand moving instinctively to her still flat belly. "As certain as I can be," she said, laughing at his expression of wonder and terror. "I am a healer, remember? I know the signs." Thorn felt his world shift and expand in ways he couldn't have imagined. A child. Their child. The idea of becoming a father filled him with a joy so intense it was almost painful. That night, he began carving a cradle from a single piece of cedar, working by lamplight while Mara slept. Each cut of the knife was an act of love, a promise to the child they'd created together. He carved protective symbols into the headboard mountains for strength, trees for growth, stars for guidance. By the time he finished, weeks later, it was a work of art worthy of the prince or princess who would sleep within it. But even as they celebrated this new blessing, signs of the outside world's intrusion continued to appear. Tracks in the mud near the lower trails, distant smoke from campfires that had no business in his territory. The men who'd hunted Mara hadn't given up, they'd simply changed their approach. "They're being more careful now," Thorn observed one evening after finding fresh horse sign near the creek crossing. "Staying back, watching, waiting for their moment." "What do they want?" Mara asked, her hand resting protectively on her growing belly. "It can't just be about the debts James left. There has to be something more." "There is," Thorn said grimly. "There always is. Men don't track a woman into the wilderness over a few unpaid bills." He was right, though neither of them knew just how right, until the day Mara found the document hidden in the lining of her old traveling baga. Document that would change everything they thought they knew about her past and the forces arrayed against their future. The cradle Thorn carved became the centerpiece of their transformed cabin, its smooth cedar surface glowing golden in the firelight. Every evening, as Mara's pregnancy progressed, he would run his hands over the wood, adding tiny details, a leaf here, a flower there, each mark, an expression of his growing anticipation and protective love. "You're going to spoil this child before it's even born," Mara teased one evening, watching him add delicate scrollwork to the cradle's sides. "Good," Thorn replied without looking up from his work. "A child should know from the very beginning that it's wanted, treasured." Mara moved closer, her hand coming to rest on his shoulder. At 6 months along, her pregnancy showed clearly now, rounding her figure in ways that filled Thorn with wonder every time he looked at her. "You're going to be an extraordinary father." "I hope so." He set down his carving knife and turned to face her. "I never had much of an example to follow. My father was a good man, but I was so young when—" "You'll know what to do," Mara said firmly. I see how gentle you are with injured animals, how carefully you tend your garden. This child will be loved beyond measure." That night, as they lay in bed with Mara's head on his shoulder, Thorn felt the baby kick for the first time, a strong, definite movement against his hand that made him catch his breath in amazement. "She's active tonight," Mara murmured sleepily. "She, or he. I have a feeling, though." She guided his hand to a different spot on her belly. "Feel that? The way the baby moves, purposeful but gentle. Like someone who's going to be a healer." Another kick, stronger this time, as if the child was responding to their conversation. Thorn felt tears prick his eyes at the reality of this son or daughter already making their presence known, already part of their mountain family. "What will we call her?" he asked. "If it's a girl, Sarah," Mara said without hesitation. "After your sister." Thorn went very still. He'd mentioned Sarah only once, briefly, when telling Mara about the fire that had taken his family. That she would remember, that she would want to honor his lost sister's memory in such a profound way, moved him more than he could express. "And if it's a boy," he managed. "Thomas, after your father." She shifted to look at him in the darkness. "I want our children to know where they come from, to understand the love that brought them into being." "Children?" he asked, catching the plural. Even in the dim light, he could see her smile. "You don't think we're going to stop at one, do you? I've seen how happy you are with just the idea of this baby. I think you're meant to have a houseful." The thought filled him with a joy so intense it was almost frightening. A house full of children, their children, growing up wild and free on the mountain, learning the lessons the wilderness had to teach while surrounded by the love he and Mara would give them. "How many?" he asked, only half joking. "As many as the mountain provides," she replied seriously. "As many as we can love and care for, properly." Summer brought changes beyond Mara's growing pregnancy. The men hunting her had become bolder, their presence a constant shadow at the edges of Thorn's awareness. He found evidence of their camps, their reconnaissance, their patient observation of the cabin and its surroundings. "They're professional," he told Mara one evening, after discovering fresh tracks near his hunting blind. "Military training, maybe, or law enforcement. They know how to move unseen, how to watch without being watched." "But you've seen them anyway," she pointed out. "Because this is my mountain. I know every stone, every tree, every natural sound. When something doesn't belong, I notice." He checked the action on his rifle, a habit that had become automatic. "The question is what they're waiting for." "They're waiting for me to leave the cabin alone," Mara said quietly. "For you to go hunting or checking traps, leaving me unprotected. That's not going to happen. Thorn, you can't watch me every moment, and I can't stay trapped inside indefinitely." She placed a hand on her rounded belly. "When the baby comes, we'll need supplies, medical preparations. There will be times when you have to leave." She was right, and they both knew it. The approaching birth added urgency to everything, a deadline that worked in their enemy's favor. A pregnant woman was vulnerable in ways that went beyond physical protection she needed. Stability, safety, medical care if complications arose. That night, Thorn began making preparations for a siege. He cached weapons and ammunition at strategic points around the cabin, created hidden escape routes, established signals they could use to communicate if separated. It was military thinking applied to domestic protection, and it felt both necessary and deeply wrong that such precautions were needed. "I keep thinking about what kind of world we're bringing a child into," Mara said as she watched him clean and oil his collection of rifles. "What kind of life this will be, always looking over our shoulders." "It won't always be like this," Thorn promised. "Once we know what they want, we can deal with it, end it. And if what they want is me, if the only way to end it is—" "No," his voice cut through her words like a blade. "That's not an option, Mara. Whatever this is about, whatever they think you have or know, we'll find another way." But even as he spoke the words, Thorn felt the weight of their situation pressing down like an approaching storm. Men didn't pursue a pregnant woman into the wilderness without powerful motivation. Whatever secret Mara carried, whether she knew it or not, was valuable enough to justify months of patient hunting? The answer came in late summer, when Mara was in her 8th month and moving with the careful, deliberate pace of a woman near her time. She was reorganizing their medical supplies when she found a document sewn into the lining of her old traveling bag, so carefully she'd never noticed it before. "Thorn," she called, her voice strange. "You need to see this." He found her sitting on their bed, holding a folded piece of paper with hands that trembled slightly. The document looked official, heavy paper with formal seals and legal language. "What is it?" "A deed," she said quietly, "to property James inherited from his father. Land I didn't even know he owned." She looked up at him, her eyes wide with understanding and fear. "Mineral rights, Thorn. To a section of land near Helena that supposedly contains one of the richest silver veins ever discovered in Montana territory." Thorn felt the pieces clicking into place like the tumblers of a lock. "How much is it worth?" "According to this, hundreds of thousands of dollars, maybe more." She held the paper like it might burn her. "James never told me. He hid this where he thought I'd never find it." "Why would he do that?" "Because he knew what men would do to get their hands on it," she said grimly. "He was protecting me the only way he knew, how by keeping me ignorant." But ignorance was no longer an option. The secret was out, and somewhere in the darkness beyond their cabin, patient men were waiting for their chance to claim what they believed was rightfully their soar, what they'd been hired to acquire by any means necessary. That night, as they lay in bed with the deed hidden beneath their mattress, Thorn felt the first true stirrings of fear he'd experienced since boyhood. Not fear for himself, he'd long ago made peace with the possibility of dying on his mountain, but fear for Mara, for their unborn child, for the family they'd built in their small corner of the wilderness. "We could leave," Mara said quietly in the darkness. "Take the deed, claim the land, use the money to start over somewhere else." "Run away, you mean?" "Make a strategic retreat," she corrected. "Find somewhere safer to raise our children." Thorn considered this, weighing the practical wisdom of her suggestion against everything the mountain meant to him. This cabin, this life was all he'd known for 23 years. The idea of abandoning it felt like another kind of death. "No," he said finally. "This is our home, Mara. Our children should be born here, should grow up here. We don't run from what's ours. Then we fight. Then we fight." Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of early snow and the promise of a hard winter ahead. But inside their cabin, with the marriage quilt pulled up around them and their unborn child moving restlessly in Mara's womb, Thorn felt a determination settle in his bones like iron. Whatever came, they would face it together. The mountain had taught him many lessons over the years, but perhaps the most important was this: some things were worth any price to protect. The document that changed everything was neither the deed Mara had found nor any legal paper at all. It was a letter, discovered by accident when Thorn was reinforcing the cabin's window frames against the coming winter. Hidden behind a loose board in the walla board that had been carefully loosened and replaced was a small oilskin pouch containing papers that James Ellison had concealed, even from his wife. "He knew," Mara whispered, reading her late husband's handwriting by lamplight. Dear God, Thorn, he knew they were coming for him. The letter was addressed to Mara, written in James's careful script and dated just 2 weeks before his death. As she read aloud, her voice growing stronger with each revelation, the true scope of their situation became clear. "My dearest Mara, if you are reading this, then my fears have come to pass, and I am no longer here to protect you. The fever that claims me now may be natural, but I suspect otherwise. Too many questions have been asked, too many strangers have appeared in town, asking about our property and my father's mining claims. The deed you will find, sewn into your traveling bag, tells only part of the story. Yes, we own mineral rights to valuable land, but that is not why dangerous men hunt us. The truth is far more complicated and far more deadly. My father was not merely a prospector, he was a government surveyor, tasked with mapping mineral deposits throughout the Montana territory. In that capacity, he discovered something that certain powerful interests would kill to suppress. The official reports filed with the territorial government vastly understate the mineral wealth of this region. Not by a little, but by millions of dollars. The conspiracy involves territorial officials, railroad barons, and mining companies working together to acquire lands at a fraction of their true value by suppressing or falsifying geological reports. My father kept copies of the real surveys, evidence that would expose the theft of resources worth more money than most men see in 10 lifetimes. That evidence is hidden where only you can find it, my dear one, in the place where we first spoke of love, beneath the marker of our happiest day. You will know the place when you see it, for your heart will remember what your mind might forget. I pray these words never reach your eyes, that my fears prove groundless, and this letter remains forever unread. But if that prayer goes unanswered, know that the men who hunt you will stop at nothing. They are not mere outlaws or claim jumpers, they are agents of wealth and power that operates above the law. Trust no one in authority. Seek the highest ground you can find and prepare to fight for more than just your life. You carry evidence that could topple territorial governments and destroy fortunes built on theft. Forever your devoted husband, James. Mara lowered the letter, her hands shaking. He's talking about our special place, the meadow where he proposed. We buried a time capsule there on our wedding day, letters we wrote to our future selves. How far? Thorne asked, though he was already calculating distances and risks. 15 miles southwest, near Beaver Creek, in a high meadow that overlooks. She stopped, sudden understanding dawning on her face. The land, the deed, describes. That meadow sits right in the middle of it. Thorne studied the letter again, his mind working through the implications. This isn't about your mineral rights at all. It's about what your husband's father discovered, proof of a conspiracy that reaches into the highest levels of territorial government. Evidence that could make us wealthy beyond imagining, Mara said quietly, or get us killed. Both, most likely. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their situation settling around them like mountain snow. Outside, wind rattled the cabin's shutters, and somewhere in the darkness, patient enemies waited for their moment. We have to retrieve it, Mara said finally. Whatever James's father hidden, we need to find it before they do. You're 8 months pregnant, Thorne pointed out. A 15-mile ride over mountain terrain. I can't have this child while that evidence is still out there, she interrupted. As long as it exists, as long as they believe I might know where it is, our family will never be safe. Our children will grow up hunted. She was right, and they both knew it. But the timing couldn't have been worse. Mara was weeks away from giving birth. The weather was turning toward winter, and their enemies were closer than they'd ever been. There's something else, Thorne said reluctantly. If we leave the cabin now, we might not make it back before the baby comes. Mountain weather this time of year, storms can blow in with no warning. Then we'll deliver the child in the wilderness if we have to, Mara said with quiet determination. You have medical knowledge. I'm a trained healer. Women have been giving birth without doctors or midwives for thousands of years. Thorne looked at his wife, really looked at her. 7 months of mountain living had transformed her from the half-frozen refugee who'd collapsed at his door into something fierce and resilient. Her face showed the confidence of a woman who'd learned to trust herself completely, who'd discovered reserves of strength she'd never known she possessed. When do we leave? He asked. Tomorrow before dawn, while they think we're still sleeping safely in our cabin. That night, they made their preparations with the careful thoroughness that meant the difference between success and death in the wilderness. Thorne packed their gear for a journey that might last several days, including emergency medical supplies in case Mara went into labor on the trail. Food, weapons, tools for digging, everything they might need to retrieve whatever James's father had hidden and defend themselves if discovered. Mara prepared her own pack with the focused intensity of a woman who understood that this journey would determine her child's future. She included birthing supplies wrapped in oiled cloth, herbs for pain management, and emergency medicines, her medical bag, carefully organized and checked twice. "If something happens to me out there," she said as she worked, "promise me you'll raise our child to know the truth. About us, about this place, about what we fought for." "Nothing's going to happen to you," Thorn said firmly. "I won't let it. Promise me anyway." "I promise, but you're going to be fine, Mara. We both are, all three of us." She smiled at that, her hand moving to her rounded belly. "All three of us," she agreed. They left before sunrise, when the world existed in shades of grey and silver, and the morning mist provided natural concealment for their departure. Thorn had chosen a route that avoided the obvious trails, following deer paths and creek beds that would make them harder to track. Mara rode easily despite her pregnancy, her seat on the horse confident and her attention alert to their surroundings. 7 months of mountain living had taught her to read the wilderness almost as well as Thorn himself, and she spotted signs of their pursuers that he might have missed. "Fresh tracks here," she said, pointing to disturbed earth near a creek crossing, "no more than a day old." Thorn studied the sign, noting the size and spacing of the hoof prints. 3 horses, moving fast. They're ahead of us now, between us and the meadow. Can we go around them? Maybe, but it would add hours to our journey, and with the weather coming in, he gestured toward the gathering clouds on the northern horizon. "We might not make it back before the storm hits." Mara followed his gaze, reading the weather signs he'd taught her. Dark clouds, the particular quality of light that preceded mountain storms, the way the wind was shifting. A blizzard was coming, and it would arrive within 24 hours. "Then we go through them," she said calmly, "whatever it takes." As they rode deeper into the mountains, following trails that few men had ever seen, Thorn felt the familiar sensation of events moving beyond his control. For 23 years, he'd shaped his world through careful planning and methodical preparation. Now, with Mara beside him and their unborn child's future hanging in the balance, he was riding toward a confrontation that would test everything he'd learned about survival in the wilderness. But as he looked at his wife, her face set with quiet determination, her hands steady on the reins despite the danger ahead, he felt something he'd almost forgotten was possible. Hope. Not just for survival, but for victory. For the chance to build the life they'd dreamed of in the safety and peace they deserved. The evidence that could destroy their enemies lay somewhere ahead, hidden beneath the marker of Mara's happiest day. All they had to do was reach it first, retrieve it, and survive whatever came next. In the growing light of dawn, with storm clouds gathering on the horizon and the sound of distant hoofbeats echoing off the mountain walls, Thorn and Mara rode toward a destiny that would either free them forever or destroy everything they'd built together. The meadow where James had proposed to Mara lay in a natural bowl surrounded by granite cliffs, accessible only through a narrow pass that could be easily defended or tragically trapped. As they approached through the pre-dawn darkness, Thorn's tactical mind catalogued every advantage and vulnerability the terrain offered. "There," Mara whispered, pointing toward a stand of aspen trees near the meadow's center. "Under the largest tree, that's where we buried our time capsule." Thorn studied the approach through his rifle scope, noting the complete lack of cover between the pass and the trees. 50 yards of open ground that would leave them exposed to anyone positioned on the surrounding ridges. The tactical situation was a night merino concealment, limited escape routes, and an unknown number of enemies who might already be in position. "We'll have to move fast," he said, sketching a rough battle plan on a piece of birch bark with charcoal from their cold fire. "I'll go first. Draw any fire. You follow only when I signal all clear." "No." Mara's voice carried the quiet authority of a woman who'd made an irrevocable decision. "We go together or not at all. I won't have you sacrificing yourself for me." "Mara, be reasonable. You're 8 months pregnant. Which means our child's future depends on both of us surviving this." She placed her hand over his, on the rough sketch. "Besides, you'll need me to find the exact spot. James and I chose a marker that only I would recognize." Thorn wanted to argue, but her logic was sound. Without her precise knowledge of where the evidence was hidden, He could spend hours digging in the wrong place. Hours they didn't have, with storm clouds building overhead and enemies closing in. "All right," he said reluctantly, "but we do this my way. Fast and quiet, minimal exposure time. Get in, get what we came for, get out." They cached their horses in a sheltered grove a quarter-mile from the meadow, concealing them where the animals would be safe but available for a quick escape. Thorn distributed weapons and ammunition, checking every piece of gear with the thoroughness of a man who understood that forgotten details killed people in situations like this. "Remember," he said as they made their final preparations, "if shooting starts, you get to cover and stay there. Don't try to help me fight, just survive long enough for me to finish it." Mara nodded, but he could see in her eyes that she had no intention of hiding while he faced danger alone. 7 months of mountain living had changed her in fundamental ways, awakening strengths and instincts she'd never known she possessed. She was no longer the grieving widow who'd stumbled to his door. She was a mountain woman, fierce in defense of her family. The approach to the meadow took 30 minutes of careful movement through broken terrain, using every bit of cover the landscape provided. Dawn was breaking as they reached the final ridge overlooking their destination, painting the granite cliffs in shades of rose and gold. "Beautiful," Mara whispered, and Thorn knew she was remembering another dawn years ago when James had brought her to this same place to ask for her hand in marriage. "Focus," he murmured gently. "Beauty can wait until we're safe." They moved down into the meadow like ghosts, using shadows and terrain features to mask their approach to the aspen grove. The largest tree stood exactly where Mara had indicated, its white bark scarred with old initials and hearts carved by lovers who'd found this hidden sanctuary. "Here," Mara said, kneeling at the base of the tree despite her ungainly condition. 3 feet due north of the main trunk, 18 inches down. Thorn began digging with the folding shovel he'd brought, working as quietly as possible while constantly scanning the surrounding ridges for signs of movement. The earth came away easily, too easily, as if it had been disturbed recently. "Someone's been here," he said grimly, showing Mara the neat layers of soil that spoke of careful excavation and replacement. "The hole's been dug and filled in again." Mara's face went pale. "But that's impossible. No one else knew." She stopped, understanding dawning in her eyes. "Unless James told someone before he died, under duress, or someone's been watching you longer than we thought," Thorn finished. "Following you, learning your patterns, waiting for you to lead them here." The implications hit them both simultaneously. If their enemies already had the evidence, then this entire journey had been a trap. They were exposed, far from shelter, with a storm approaching and nowhere to run. A rifle shot cracked across the meadow, the bullet striking the tree trunk inches from Thorn's head. Then another, and another, the reports echoing off the granite walls like thunder. "Down!" Thorn shouted, grabbing Mara and pulling her behind the meager cover of the aspen's trunk. Bark exploded around them as more shots found their mark, filling the air with splinters and the acrid smell of gunpowder. Through the chaos, Thorn caught glimpses of muzzle flashes from 3 different positions on the surrounding ridges, a crossfire that had been carefully planned and expertly executed. Whoever these men were, they knew their business. "How many?" Mara asked, her voice steady despite the bullets whining overhead. 3 that I can see, maybe more." Thorn assessed their tactical situation with the cold calculation that had kept him alive for 23 years in the wilderness. "They've got us pinned down, but they can't advance without exposing themselves to return fire." "What do they want?" "To take you alive," he said grimly. "If they wanted us dead, they'd have shot us in the open. This is about making us surrender." As if to confirm his assessment, a voice called out from the rocks above, educated, authoritative, carrying the accent of someone who'd never known a day of genuine hardship. "Mrs. Ellison, we know you're down there. We have what we came for, but we need you to verify its authenticity. Cooperate, and no one has to get hurt." Mara looked at Thorn with grim understanding. "They found it. Whatever James's father hid, they have it now." "Maybe," Thorn said, "or maybe they're bluffing, hoping you'll give up without a fight." Another voice joined the first, rougher, more impatient. "We can wait all day if we have to, lady. But that storm's coming in fast, and you're going to freeze to death long before we do." It was true. Already, Thorn could feel the temperature dropping as the wind picked up. The first snowflakes had begun to fall, and within hours this meadow would be a killing ground of wind and cold that would claim anyone caught in the open. "We need to move," he told Mara quietly. "Find better cover, force them to change position, make them come to us instead of waiting for the weather to do their work." "Where? There's nothing but open ground between here and the rocks." Thorn studied the terrain with fresh eyes, looking for options he might have missed. The meadow was a natural amphitheater, offering excellent fields of fire for anyone positioned on the ridges, but precious little cover for anyone caught in the center. But there a depression in the ground where an old creek had once run, now filled with fallen logs and dense brush. "There's a gully about 20 yards to our left," he whispered to Mara. "If we can reach it, we'll have better cover and a possible escape route toward the creek." 20 yards of open ground, she said, measuring the distance with her eyes. "In my condition, that might as well be 20 miles. I'll lay down covering fire. Move when I tell you, and don't stop until you reach the gully." Mara nodded, her face set with determination despite the fear he could see in her eyes. As she prepared to move, Thorn noticed something that made his blood run colder, wet stains spreading across the back of her dress. "Mara," he said quietly, "look at me." She turned, and he saw the truth in her expression before she spoke. "My water broke," she said simply. "The baby's coming." The timing couldn't have been worse. Labor could last hours or minutes, and either way, it would leave them completely vulnerable. Thorn felt panic rising in his chest, a sensation he hadn't experienced since he was 12 years old and watching his family's farm burn. "How long do we have?" he asked. "I don't know. First babies usually take their time, but with all this stress," she gasped as a contraction hit, her hand gripping his arm with surprising strength. "Not long." She finished when it passed. The men on the ridges must have sensed something was wrong, because their leader called out again. "Mrs. Ellison, we're losing patience. Show yourself now, or we start putting bullets closer to your position." To emphasize the point, a shot struck the ground inches from Thorn's feet, showering them with dirt and gravel. The message was clear: their enemies were done waiting. "New plan," Thorn said grimly, checking his rifle and the spare ammunition he carried. "I'm going to give you covering fire to reach that gully. Once you're there, you stay put no matter what happens. If I don't make it—" "You're going to make it," Mara said fiercely. "We both are, all three of us." Another contraction seized her, stronger this time, and Thorn saw her bite her lip to keep from crying out. The baby was coming whether they were ready or not, and their enemies weren't going to wait for nature to take its course. "On my mark," he said, raising his rifle. 3, 2, 1, go." Thorn came up firing, working the lever action of his Winchester with practiced efficiency. His shots were aimed not to kill, but to force their attackers to keep their heads down, buying Mara precious seconds to cross the open ground. She moved with surprising speed despite her condition, running in a low crouch that made her a difficult target. Bullets whined around her, kicking up spurts of dirt and striking rocks with metallic spangs, but none found their mark. She made it to the gully just as Thorn's ammunition ran low. He dove after her, sliding down the muddy bank as return fire intensified. For a moment, they lay side by side in the shallow depression, both breathing hard from exertion and fear. "You're hit," Mara said, noticing blood on his left arm. Thorn looked down to see a shallow groove where a bullet had creased his bicep. "Just a scratch," he said, though the wound burned like fire. "How are you holding up?" "The contractions are getting stronger," she admitted. "Maybe 10 minutes apart." 10 minutes. If labor progressed normally, they might have an hour or two. But nothing about this situation was normal, and stress could accelerate the process dramatically. "Listen to me," Thorn said, reloading his rifle with swift, economical movements. "I'm going to work my way around to the north ridge, try to flank them. You stay here, stay quiet, and if the baby starts coming—" "I know what to do," she said simply. "I'm a healer, remember? If something happens to me, nothing's going to happen to you." Her voice carried the authority of absolute faith. "You're going to drive them off, and then you're going to help me deliver our child in this God-forsaken gully, and we're all going to go home together." Thorn looked at his wife, Muddy, frightened, in labor, but still radiating the quiet strength that had first attracted him to Herond, felt his panic transform into something harder and more useful. Cold, focused rage at the men who would threaten his family. "Stay down," he said, kissing her forehead quickly. "I'll be back." He began working his way along the gully, using the fallen logs and brush for concealment. Above him, their attackers continued firing sporadically, but their shots were poorly aimed now. They were shooting at shadows, unsure of their target's exact position. The storm was intensifying, snow falling heavily enough to reduce visibility and muffle sound. That worked in Thorn's favor, allowing him to move more freely while making it harder for the men on the ridges to coordinate their efforts. As he moved, he could hear Mara breathing through another contraction behind him, the sound barely audible above the wind. Each labored breath reminded him of what was at stake, not just their lives, but the life of their unborn child and the future they'd fought so hard to build. The north ridge was steeper than it looked from below, but Thorn climbed with the sure-footed confidence of a man who'd spent 23 years navigating mountain terrain. His wounded arm ached, but the pain only sharpened his focus. When he reached the top, he could see their attackers' position clearly for the first time. 3 men, well-armed, and positioned to control the meadow, but vulnerable to attack from behind. They'd made the classic mistake of assuming their targets were trapped and helpless. Thorn settled into position among the rocks, his rifle steady despite the wind and snow. From here, he could end this fight in seconds. But as he prepared to fire, a sound from the meadow below made his blood freeze in his veins. Mara's voice, raised in a cry of pain that could only mean one thing: their child was coming, ready or not. The sound of Mara's labored breathing carried up the mountainside like a bell ringing across the meadow. Thorn froze in position, torn between the tactical necessity of eliminating the threat above and the desperate need to be beside his wife as their child entered the world. The decision was made for him when the lead gunman stood up from his concealed position, obviously having heard the same sound. "Well, well," the man called down toward the gully. "Sounds like we're about to have a blessed event. Boys, I think Mrs. Ellison's situation just became a lot more urgent." Through his rifle scope, Thorn could see the man clearly for the first time, well-dressed despite the wilderness setting, with the soft hands and pale complexion of someone who spent most of his time behind a desk. Not the kind of man who usually did his own dirty work, which meant this operation was important enough to demand personal supervision. "Here's what's going to happen," the man continued, his voice carrying easily in the thin mountain air. "Mrs. Ellison is going to come out of that gully nice and slow, hands where we can see them. In return, we'll let her husband live long enough to help deliver that baby before we settle our business." Thorn felt rage build in his chest, like a physical force. These men weren't just threatening his family, they were trying to use his unborn child as leverage, turning the miracle of birth into a weapon against him. He settled the rifle's crosshairs on the speaker's chest and began to squeeze the trigger. A sound from below stopped him, not Mara's voice this time, but something that made his blood run cold. The distinctive ring of metal, striking metal, repeated 3 times in quick succession. The family bell. Thorn had forged it himself during their first winter together, hanging it from a post near the cabin so they could signal each other across distances. 3 rings meant extreme danger, immediate help needed. But the cabin was 15 miles away, and no one else knew the signal's meaning. Unless... Another voice echoed across the meadow, younger and more familiar than Thorn wanted to admit. "Pa, Ma, you in there?" Thomas, their firstborn son, now 17 years old, and possessed of his father's stubborn independence and his mother's protective instincts. Somehow, he'd tracked them here, arriving at exactly the worst possible moment. The lead gunman's head snapped up, scanning the ridges for this new arrival. Who the hell? He never finished the sentence. Thorne's rifle spoke once, the heavy bullet taking the man's center mass and spinning him around before he collapsed behind the rocks. The other two gunmen immediately swung their weapons toward the sound of the shot, but Thorne was already moving, using the terrain and weather to mask his position. "Thomas!" he called out, his voice carrying the authority that had guided his son through 17 years of mountain living. "Stay back. Cover the approaches." A rifle cracked from somewhere to the east, not one of the enemy weapons, but the distinctive report of the 30-30 Thorne had taught his son to shoot. One of the remaining gunmen cried out, and his rifle clattered down the rocks, apparently wounded though not killed. The last gunman, realizing his tactical situation had collapsed, made a desperate play. Instead of trying to escape, he began working his way down toward the gully where Mara lay helpless. "I've got the woman," he shouted. "Back off or she dies." Thorne felt the world narrow to a single point of focus. Everything he'd learned about survival, about tactics, about reading terrain and weather and human nature, condensed into this moment. His wife was in labor, his son was somewhere in the rocks above, and a desperate man with a gun was closing in on both of them. He began moving down the ridge, using speed instead of stealth now. The gunman would reach Mara's position in minutes, and once he had a hostage, the tactical advantage would shift completely. Below in the gully, Mara's voice rose in another cry of pain and effort. The baby was coming whether the world was safe for it or not, following nature's schedule rather than human convenience. Thorne reached the bottom of the slope just as the gunman appeared at the edge of the gully, his rifle trained downward toward Mara's position. For a frozen moment, hunter and hunted stared at each other across 30 yards of broken ground. "Drop the rifle," the gunman called out, his voice tight with desperation. "Drop it now or I put a bullet in your wife." "You do that, and my son puts one in you." Thorne replied calmly, though his heart was hammering against his ribs. "Look around, friend. You're outnumbered and outgunned. Time to make better choices." The man's eyes darted toward the ridges, obviously seeing Thomas's muzzle flash and understanding that his situation was hopeless. But desperation made men dangerous in ways that logic couldn't predict. "Maybe," he said, "but I can still take her with me." He began to lower his rifle toward Mara's position. Thorne didn't think, didn't calculate, didn't weigh odds or consider consequences. 23 years of mountain living had honed his reflexes to the point where thought and action became the same thing. His rifle came up and spoke once, the bullet taking the gunman high in the shoulder and spinning him away from the gully's edge. The man's weapon discharged harmlessly into the air as he fell, the shot echoing off the granite walls like thunder. Then silence, broken only by the wind and the sound of Mara breathing through another contraction. "Ma," Thomas's voice called from above. "You all right?" "Fine," Mara called back, though her voice was strained with effort. "But your little brother or sister has decided this is a good time to make an appearance." Thorne reached the gully just as the next contraction seized her. She gripped his hand with strength that surprised him, her face set with the fierce concentration of a woman doing the hardest work in the world. "How long between contractions?" he asked, checking her pulse and trying to remember everything he'd read about childbirth in his medical texts. 3 minutes, she gasped. "Maybe less. This baby's in a hurry." Above them, Thomas appeared at the gully's edge, his young face tight with concern and excitement. "Pa, there's more riders coming up the valley, maybe 6 or 7 of them." Thorne felt his heart sink. Whatever organization had sent, the first 3 men had obviously planned for contingencies. The fight wasn't over, it was just beginning. "How far out?" he called up to his son. "Hour, maybe less. They're pushing hard despite the snow." An hour. Mara would almost certainly give birth before then, leaving them with a newborn to protect as well as themselves. The tactical situation was going from bad to impossible. But as he looked at his wife's face, saw the determination there despite her pain, Thorne felt something shift inside him. For 23 years, he'd thought of survival in terms of avoiding conflict, staying hidden, keeping his head down. Now, with his family threatened and his child about to be born, survival meant standing and fighting for what was his. "Thomas," he called, "get down here. Your mother's about to need our help, and after that, we've got more visitors to deal with." As his sons scrambled down into the gully, Thorn began gathering the supplies they'd need for an emergency delivery. The storm was intensifying, enemy reinforcements were approaching, and somewhere in the chaos, his second child was about to enter a world that seemed determined to destroy everything he loved. But they were together all of the mand that made them stronger than any force their enemies could bring against them. The deed and surveyor's reports were exactly where the wounded gunman said they'd be sealed in an oilskin pouch and hidden beneath a carefully arranged pile of stones. But it was Mara who made the connection that changed everything, even as another contraction gripped her with increasing intensity. "Those aren't just survey reports," she said, studying the documents with the focused attention of someone who'd spent years reading legal papers for her healing practice. "Look at the signatures, the official seals. These prove that territorial officials have been deliberately falsifying mineral surveys for years." Thorn glanced at the papers while keeping watch for the approaching riders. Even his untrained eye could see the significant detailed geological reports that painted a picture of mineral wealth beyond imagination, signed by territorial governors and federal land commissioners, who'd then filed completely different documents with Washington. "How much are we talking about?" Thomas asked, reloading his rifle with the calm efficiency Thorn had taught him. "Millions," Mara said simply. "Maybe tens of millions, enough to buy governors, judges, entire territorial governments." She looked up at Thorn with grim understanding. "Enough to kill anyone who threatens to expose it." Another contraction hit, stronger than the previous ones, and Mara gripped Thorn's hand hard enough to leave marks. "The baby's coming now," she said through gritted teeth. "Not in an hour, not in 30 minutes. Now." Thorn made a decision that went against every tactical instinct he'd developed over 23 years of mountain living. Instead of preparing defensive positions or planning their escape, he holstered his rifle and knelt beside his wife. "Thomas," he said quietly, "you're going to have to hold them off while I help your mother." His son's face went pale, but his voice remained steady. "How long?" "However long it takes," Thorn replied, beginning to arrange their medical supplies. "Your mother needs me here, and that's where I'm staying." "Pa, there's 7 of them coming up that trail. And there's one of you on the high ground with a rifle and 23 years of mountain training," Thorn interrupted. "You know this terrain better than they do. Use that advantage." Thomas nodded, understanding passing between father and son without need for further words. He checked his ammunition one final time, then began working his way up to a defensive position among the rocks. Mara's next contraction was the strongest yet, and when it passed, she looked at Thorn with the clear-eyed focus of a woman who'd accepted what was coming. "The baby's crowning," she said simply. "Get ready to catch your child." What followed was the most terrifying and miraculous 30 minutes of Thorn's life. While rifle fire echoed from the ridges above, Thomas engaging the approaching riders with the patient accuracy his father had taught him, Mara brought their second child into the world with a strength and determination that left Thorn awed. The baby emerged during a brief lull in the gunfire, as if she'd been waiting for a moment of relative peace. A girl, tiny but perfect, with dark hair like her mother's and lungs, that announced her displeasure with the cold mountain air in no uncertain terms. "Sarah," Mara whispered, tears streaming down her face as Thorn placed their daughter in her arms. "Her name is Sarah." For a moment, the world contracted to just the 3 of them, husband, wife, and newborn daughter wrapped in furs at the bottom of a muddy gully, while a storm raged overhead. It should have been a moment of pure joy, but the sound of approaching hoofbeats reminded them that their fight was far from over. "They're almost in position," Thomas called down from his perch. "I can't hold them much longer." Thorn looked at the documents scattered around them, then at his wife holding their newborn daughter, and finally up toward the sound of his son's rifle. Everything he'd built, everything he loved, hung in the balance of the next few minutes. "Mara," he said quietly, "can you travel?" She nodded, though he could see the exhaustion in her face. "If I have to." "You have to." He began gathering the papers, stuffing them back into their oilskin pouch. These documents, they're our way out of this. Proof of corruption that reaches the highest levels of territorial government. We can't fight their organization directly, but we can destroy it. How? By making sure the right people see these papers. Federal authorities, newspaper editors, people who can't be bought or intimidated. He helped her to her feet, supporting her weight while she held their daughter. But first, we have to survive the next hour. The rifle fire above intensified, and Thomas's voice carried a note of urgency. "Pa, they're flanking me on the south ridge." Thorne made another decision that would have seemed impossible just hours earlier. Instead of running, instead of trying to escape with his family, he began climbing toward the sound of the guns. "Stay here," he told Mara. "Keep Sarah warm and quiet. I'm going to help Thomas." "Thorne, I love you," he said simply. "Both of you. All of you. Remember that." He climbed out of the gully and into a world transformed by snow and violence. The storm had intensified, reducing visibility to mere yards. But the sound of gunfire guided him toward his son's position. When he reached the rocks where Thomas had taken cover, he found the boy bleeding from a graze across his forehead, but still fighting with grim determination. "Situation?" Thorne asked, settling into position beside his son. "7 riders, like I said. They split up 3, coming straight up the main trail, 2 working around to the south, 2 more trying to circle behind us." Thomas wiped blood from his eyes and continued firing. "I got one of them for sure, wounded another, but they're too spread out. I can't cover all the approaches." Thorne studied the terrain, reading the tactical situation with the same skill he'd once used to track game through heavy forest. Their enemies had the numbers and the equipment, but they were fighting in conditions that favored defenders who knew the ground. "New plan," he said, checking his ammunition. "We don't try to hold this position. We make them come to us one at a time, channel them into killing ground." "The pass," Thomas said, understanding immediately. "Force them through the narrow gap where they can't spread out." "Exactly. But first we need to make sure your mother and sister can get clear." They began a fighting withdrawal, using the storm and terrain to mask their movements while staying between their attackers and the gully where Mara waited with their newborn daughter. It was dangerous, requiring them to expose themselves repeatedly to draw fire away from their family, but it worked. When they reached the narrow pass that controlled access to the meadow, Thorne felt the tactical situation shift in their favor for the first time. Here, their enemies' numbers meant nothing. The pass was barely wide enough for 1 horse at a time, and the steep walls on either side prevented flanking maneuvers. "This is where we make our stand," he told Thomas. "Whatever happens, they don't get past us." His son nodded, his young face set with the same determination Thorne had carried through 23 years of mountain solitude. "They won't, Pa, I promise." As the sound of approaching riders grew louder, echoing off the canyon walls like thunder, Thorne felt something settle in his chest that he hadn't experienced since he was 12 years old. Not just the will to survive, but the absolute certainty that some things were worth any sacrifice to protect. His family was safe behind him, his son fought beside him, and somewhere in the storm ahead, their enemies were about to learn why mountain folk had a reputation for being left alone. 10 years later, Thorne stood in the same meadow where his daughter Sarah had been born, watching his 11 sons practice the lessons he'd taught them about reading weather, tracking game, and understanding the mountain's ever-changing moods. The aspen grove had grown taller, and where once there had been a simple time capsule, now stood something far more significant, a massive pine tree into which he'd carved the complete history of his family. The family tree carving had taken him 3 years to complete, working during the quiet winter evenings when snow covered the world and his children gathered around the fire to hear stories of the old days. Every birth was recorded there, every milestone, every lesson learned in their high country home. Names and dates spiraled up the trunk in careful script, but more than Thaith had carved scenes from their life together, images that would tell their story long after the last of them had passed from the earth. At the base of the tree, surrounded by protective symbols and flourishing plant life, he'd inscribed the words that had guided him through the transformation from isolated mountain man to devoted father. Love doesn't just thaw a man's heart, it builds a kingdom from silence. Pa called his youngest son Marcus, now 7 years old, and possessed of his mother's healing instincts and his father's stubborn independence. Ma says to tell you the federal marshal's here. Thorne smiled, running his hand over the carved bark, one final time before turning toward the cabin. The federal investigation that had resulted from those documents, the evidence that had cost so much to retrieve and protect, had ultimately toppled 3 territorial governors, exposed a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government and secured his family's safety permanently. More than that, it had established the legal precedent that mineral rights belonged to the people who worked the land, not the wealthy interests who sought to steal it. The cabin had grown over the years, expanding from Thorne's original single room into a sprawling complex that housed his large family comfortably. But at its heart remained the same fireplace where Mara had first laughed, the same window where he'd stood watching for her return from herb-gathering expeditions, the same solid timbers that had sheltered them through their early years together. Mara waited for him on the porch, their daughter Sarah at her side. At 10 years old, Sarah had inherited her mother's gift for healing and her father's love of the mountains, moving between both worlds with the easy confidence of someone who'd never known fear or want. She would be the first of their children to receive formal education, traveling to Helena during the winter months to attend the school that federal compensation for their suffering had made possible. "Marshal Davidson wants to speak with you about the mineral leases," Mara said as Thorne approached. Despite 11 pregnancies and the challenges of mountain living, she remained as beautiful as the day she'd stumbled to his door. More so, perhaps, because now her beauty was tempered with the confidence of a woman who'd helped build something lasting and good. "Any problems?" "Quite the opposite. The silver mine is producing better than anyone expected. They want to discuss expanding the operation." She smiled, the same expression that had stopped his heart 24 years ago. "We're going to be very wealthy, Mr. Calloway." Thorne looked out over the land that had been his refuge, his sanctuary, and ultimately his kingdom. 11 sons played and worked in the meadows below, learning the skills that would carry them forward into a changing world. His daughter studied at her mother's side, mastering the healing arts that would serve their community for generations. And somewhere in the distance, the sound of laughter echoed off the mountain walls, not just Mara's laughter now, but the voices of children who'd never known a day without love, security, and the absolute certainty that they belonged exactly where they were. "We're already wealthy," he said quietly, slipping his arm around his wife's waist. "Money's just a way of keeping score." That evening, as they sat by the fire with their youngest children gathered around them, Mara pulled out the marriage quilt she'd completed during her first winter in the cabin. It had become a family tradition. Each new baby was wrapped in the quilt for their first night home, connecting them to the love story that had brought them into being. "Tell us again," said Michael, their third son, and perhaps the most thoughtful of their children, "about the night Ma first laughed." Thorne looked at Mara, seeing in her eyes the same mixture of love and mischief that had captured his heart all those years ago. "It was 23 years since I'd heard a woman laugh," he began, settling into the familiar rhythm of the story his children never tired of hearing. 23 years of silence in these mountains, thinking I had everything I needed. Then your mother stumbled to our door in the middle of a blizzard, half frozen and running from troubles she couldn't fight alone. And you saved her," piped up Samuel, age 5, who always loved the dramatic parts of family stories. "We saved each other," Mara corrected gently. "Your father gave me shelter and warmth, but I gave him something too. I reminded him that some kinds of loneliness are too heavy for any man to carry alone." "And then you had us," Sarah added, grinning at her parents. "All 11 of you," Thorne confirmed, looking around at the faces illuminated by firelight. "Each one a gift we never dared to hope for." "Will you carve our stories in the tree too, Pa?" asked David, their 4th son, who'd inherited his father's love of woodworking. "Everyone," Thorn promised. "Your children's stories too, and their children after them. That tree will hold our family's history for as long as it stands." Later, after the children had been settled into their beds and the cabin had grown quiet except for the familiar sounds of wind and settling timbers, Thorn and Mara walked out onto the porch to look up at stars that shone with particular brilliance in the thin mountain air. "Do you ever regret it?" Mara asked softly. "Giving up your solitude for all this chaos?" Thorn considered the question seriously, as he always did when she asked it during their quiet moments together. 24 years of marriage had taught him that the best answers came from honest reflection, not easy reassurances. "I regret the years I spent alone," he said finally. "All that time I could have been building this life with you, raising our children, being part of something larger than my own fear and pain." He pulled her closer, feeling the solid warmth of her body against his. "But I don't regret the path that brought us together. Every moment of loneliness, every year of learning to survive on my own, it all led to that night when you knocked on my door." "And laughed over a simple bowl of stew," she added, completing the thought as she so often did. "And changed everything forever." They stood in comfortable silence, watching their breath mist in the cold air, and listening to the night sounds of the mountain wind through the trees, the distant call of an owl, the soft murmur of the creek that had run faithfully past their door for all the years of their marriage. "The boys will start leaving soon," Mara said eventually. "Thomas is already talking about establishing his own homestead further west. Michael wants to study medicine in the cities. They'll scatter across the country, building their own lives." "As they should," Thorn replied, though the thought brought a familiar ache to his chest. "We've given them roots strong enough to let them grow wherever they choose to plant themselves. And they'll come back," Mara added with the confidence of a woman who understood the pull of home. "This mountain, this cabin, this family, it's in their blood now. They'll wander, but they'll always come back." As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of laughter drifted up from the valley below one of their older sons, probably James, entertaining his younger brothers with some late-night adventure or tall tale. The sound carried clearly in the still air, bright and joyful and utterly without fear. Thorn smiled, remembering how that first laugh from Mara had broken something open in his chest that had been sealed for 23 years. Now, 24 years later, laughter filled his world daily, the sound of children at play, of family gathered around the dinner table, of a woman who'd learned to find joy even in the midst of mountain winters and the endless work of raising 11 children. "It's been a good life," he said simply. "The best life," Mara agreed, "full of everything that matters." They remained on the porch until the last sound faded from the valley and their children had settled into sleep. Then, hand in hand, they walked back into the cabin that had sheltered their love story from its very beginning, from that first night when a desperate woman's laughter had taught a lonely man how to live again, to this moment when their legacy stretched out before them in the form of 11 sons and 1 daughter who would carry their love forward into whatever future awaited. The fire burned low in the grate, casting dancing shadows on walls that had witnessed every joy and sorrow of their shared life. And in those shadows, if you knew how to look, you could see the echo of that first magical evening when silence finally gave way to laughter, and a mountain man learned that some kinds of wealth couldn't be measured in gold or silver, but only in the number of hearts that beat in harmony under your roof.